very moving experience for me after 2 weeks in Australia, a place that I wanted to come to since I was 4 years old. And finally, I am giving my last talk in Australia. I've had the privilege of giving something like 20 speeches or roundtables and talking to people all over the country. And it's been a very powerful experience for me. One reason is that, whether you know it or not, Australia holds the fate of the world's climate in its hands. And you've come to a fork in the road of your own history, a moment of decision that only you can embrace. The physics of the planet and the logic of capitalism are crashing into each other. And Australia is poised between wasting tens of billions of dollars and destroying some of the most beautiful parts of your country, or building a brilliant and beautiful future in which Australia creates a thriving, prosperous, job-filled new economy that is an example to the world. Now, one of the things that's important for us to remember is that economic change is inevitable and it's taking place all the time. I come from Somerville, Massachusetts, right across the river from Boston, and the economy of Somerville has changed dramatically in the last 150 years. I have a map in my guest room that shows a page from the Registry of Deeds, and it shows all the homes near our house which have not yet been built. And in every third building or so, there's an X drawn through it. And it took me a little while to understand that X. That X is horses. Horses. Thousands of horses in my neighborhood. That was true in the late 19th century, and 50 years later, there were 0 horses. We used to build clipper ships, fastest sailboats in the United States, and they traveled all over the world as part of our economy. They even used to cut ice from the ice ponds in northern Massachusetts, put them on the boat, cover them in sawdust, and take them all the way to Cape Town, where it was summertime, to sell ice to wealthy people who wanted to cool their drinks. We built canals to move heavy loads that operated for about 30 years until the railroads came, and the railroads functioned until trucking came. We built a Ford motor plant that survived from the 1920s to the 1950s, and then it shut down. And then we built big box retail. And that didn't work very well. Now, a whole new city is rising up on the 150 acres where we're going to have thousands of non-medical personnel from our greatest hospitals. So over and over and over, we've seen dramatic transformation. And that's true in the United States. It's true in Australia. And we see, in fact, change pressing in on many sides, whether it's from global trade, or whether it's from new technology. And on top of that, we're now facing the danger that our physical world is becoming more unpredictable and more violent. And I want to speak to that briefly. Blair mentioned, I came here from Boston, which had 7 blizzards in 3 weeks, the worst winter in the history of Boston. And it shut down our public transportation, it closed schools, and it has threatened restaurants and small business with bankruptcy because they didn't have enough customers for over a month. And around the world, we've seen drought, flooding, bushfires, melting of the polar ice cap, the Antarctic ice sheets, the glaciers of Greenland. Siberia is releasing, the permafrost is releasing methane. We've seen the expansion of tropical disease, the strangling of rivers, and on and on and on. And I know that's sometimes hard to hear, but Boston is going to have to spend billions of dollars to keep downtown Boston and Harvard and MIT from becoming part of the Atlantic Ocean. Many of the world's airports are going to be underwater. And this is important here because 85% of Australians live on the coast. So this is a challenge that everyone needs to face. Now, part of the problem is that if we're going to stay within a reasonable limit, we can only burn another 565 gigatons of carbon. But unfortunately, the fossil fuel companies have 2,700 gigatons, 5 times more, already on their balance sheets. So this means that 80% of the world's reserves must stay in the ground and never be burned. But coal, oil, gas companies seem to feel that they can keep digging and drilling and pumping and burning more and more forever and ever. Amen. Now, this is a deep problem because it intersects all the industries of the world, and it's particularly important in Australia. And yet I have heard from so many people, as Blair mentioned, that it's in some ways taboo to talk about this, to talk about change, to talk about how to address that change. That's very dangerous. We went through that in the United States. You may remember that because of a great deal of fraud, we ended up putting the election of our president to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court picked 2 oil executives to be president and vice president of the United States. And they not only suppressed any discussion, they suppressed any action. They actively instructed the departments of the U.S. federal government, a huge entity, not to think about it, not to study the problem, not to come up with any alternatives. So we lost 8 years to that. That's a terrible loss when a silence settles over a people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges with coal and fracking, and then I promise you I'm going to get to the positive things, the pathways to change, some of the very exciting things that are happening around the world. And in Australia, I have to say, I've been so impressed by some of the things I've learned here. Now, if you'll permit me to be direct, many people around the world are wondering why the Australian government is doubling down on coal and gas at the very moment when the whole planet is trying to reduce carbon emissions, when demand for coal on the global market is fading away, and when hydraulic fracturing, which we have a lot of experience with in the US, is proving to be far more dangerous than industry has admitted. And we have to be particularly careful about moving from coal to unconventional gas, because what it can do is lock you in to a long-term investment in yet another fossil fuel. Goldman Sachs, talking about coal, said, quote, just as a worker celebrating their 65th birthday can settle into a more sedate lifestyle while they look back on their past achievements, we believe that thermal coal has reached its retirement age. Coal is shrinking in the United States, both in volume and in price. Our EPA is applying more stringent regulations. Coal plants are shutting down. We used to have more than 500 coal plants. 187 have shut down so far, with 336 to go. All of them facing an active national campaign to close them. Now, of course, what that does is create a deep concern about jobs. In the United States, we have 88,000 miners and communities around Appalachia that depend on those jobs. And the United States government has tried to design a just transition, a thoughtful, rational exit for workers who, through no fault of their own, find their jobs disappearing. One of the leaders of this was Senator John McCain, who was the opponent of President Obama in his initial election in 2008. And Senator McCain worked out an elaborate plan of pension, Medicare, retraining, community investment for the tobacco industry, which was another industry that was fading in the U.S. His own party shut that down. And right now, President Obama has a just transition plan, a national plan, as part of a grand bargain in his federal 2015 budget, with hundreds of millions of dollars for job training, for innovation, for community economic development in Appalachia and in other coal areas, $1 billion to restore land and waters that have been strip mined and poisoned, and $3.9 billion for new pensions and medical coverage and retirement benefits for workers who are leaving the industry. The problem is, that's in his budget, which is going to be driven up to Capitol Hill, where the Republican Party will shut it down. problem is that this opposition to a national just transition plan is not going to protect coal. The plants and mines are going to continue to close. All it is going to do is to damage American workers who have already suffered enough. We used to have 700,000 miners 100 years ago. After World War II, we had 400,000, and now we are down to 88,000, and they are going away. For an international observer like me, the behavior of your Prime Minister at this point is literally incomprehensible, because he wants to invest tens of billions of your dollars betting the future on a fantasy. The entire argument for the billions of dollars in subsidies and for railways and for ports and all the coercive action that is damaging farming communities and poisoning groundwater and destroying ecosystems, it's all built on a single assumption, and that is that demand for coal around the world, and especially from China and India, is going to do nothing but rise. But there's a problem with this, which is that China is cutting its purchases of imported coal. 70% of coal firms in China posted losses. And the Chinese government, having invested millions of dollars and encouraged them to take out loans, wants to direct as much to Chinese mines and Chinese workers as possible. So they are shutting down coal imports as fast as they can by setting limits on the quality of coal, by putting duties. I was in China 2 months ago, and this was in the China Daily News, which is the English language paper for the government, almost every day. And I get over here and I find that they don't seem to be aware of this. Maybe we should get a subscription for the China Daily News. Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, not lefty organizations, are predicting that coal and the price of coal and the amount of coal will drop 35%, from 220 million metric tons to 143 million metric tons in a few years, and they predict it's going to stay down. And in addition, China has signed an agreement with the US to lower emissions, and the best way, the fastest way, the most efficient way to lower emissions is to cut down on coal. In India, there's some of the same issues. They are still trying to provide power to their people, but they are tired of buying international coal. They have more coal than Australia. They have more workers than Australia. In fact, they have 57 times more workers than Australia, and they would like some of them to have jobs. So it's not surprising that on November 12th, the Power and Coal Minister of India, Piyush Goyal, said, quote, "In the next 2 or 3 years, we should be able to stop imports of thermal coal. Not slow down, reduce, ease off. Stop, as in zero." And he repeated that 10 days ago, and he was backed up by the Prime Minister. So that every global investment company looking at the future says that it makes no sense to open a new mine anywhere. And yet, in Australia, I have read all about the plans to open mega coal mines in Queensland's Galilee Basin and to export this China by constructing the world's largest coal port at Abbott Point, right in the middle of the Great Barrier Reef. I was in the Great Barrier Reef. I had the privilege to go diving about 4 days ago, and it is one of humanity's greatest treasures. And the idea that one would threaten that, to build something that will not create prosperity here and that no one wants in the rest of the world, is really troubling. Now I want to talk briefly about natural gas, because I know that's important here. And I know that you have an enormous amount of natural gas. But the problem with natural gas is that when gas is extracted through fracking, the emissions are similar to coal. And so you have a problem with emissions leaking from the wellhead, which we've had in the US consistently, and the ongoing question of whether the poisonous chemicals that are injected will ever meet with our groundwater. A very deep and troubling problem. But I'll tell you the most interesting thing, which I discovered working on this in my hotel 2 nights ago. If you move towards natural gas fracking, you will be putting your most precious water supplies in great danger. And the numbers here are truly mind-blowing. A single well can use 5 million gallons of water. And they're talking about drilling as many as 100,000 wells in Western Australia. And that's not that unbelievable because in Pennsylvania alone we have 110,000 wells. So 100,000 wells using 5 million gallons of water is 500 billion gallons of water. Now this water belongs to you, and it would be provided free of charge. You have to pay for it. People who are fracking won't. And that amount, which is also 1.8 trillion liters, is enough water to support a population of almost 18 million people. There's only 2.5 million people in Western Australia. So the amount of water would be equivalent to what is used. It would be 7 times what you're already using. And that is in an area where rainfall has dropped, where you would know you're already under water restrictions, and where those are going to tighten up. So you're being asked to cut back at the very moment that this massive resource is going to be used. If Australia charged 1 penny per gallon, you would end up with $5 billion in revenue. And to give you another perspective on this, the Kwinana desalination plant creates 13.7 million gallons of clean water a year. So do you know how many wells that would support? 2.7 wells. To support 100,000 wells, you would need 37,000 desalination plants. So, to me, looking at this from the outside, this is a waste of your money, a waste of your water, and a waste of your future. Let's talk about the ways you can move towards a low-carbon economy. There's basically 3 pathways, and I'm going to be a little bit simplistic here, but we can talk about it during the panel time. One of the things I've discovered going around Australia, talking to people in the various fossil fuel areas, is that people are deeply frustrated. They're worried about what's going to happen to their jobs. They'd like to hang on to those jobs, but they also are ready to move forward. They understand that this is an industry that's fading. And overall, there's this sense that communities have been abandoned, that there's been a lack of leadership, that there's not been that promises made by companies have not turned out to be true, and that government seems to be looking out for the interest of those firms more than of people. And boy, if you need an example of this, the town of Morwell in the Latrobe Valley, where a mine fire burned for 45 days, blanketing neighbors with dense ash and soot, talking to those people was incredibly moving and incredibly disturbing. The government's response was to give the citizens face masks for breathing, a bucket to clean up the ash, and promises that the toxic clouds that they and their children were forced to breathe would have no impact on their lungs. So today, the people of the Latrobe Valley are asking, how can we save ourselves? How can we shape our own future? How, if we are facing transition no matter what, can we make sure that the choices are economically intelligent and socially just? And there are 3 basic pathways. You can either work on transition from the top, you can work on it from the bottom, or you can work on it from the sides. And I'll explain briefly what each of those mean. Let's start with the top. Abraham Lincoln said in 1854, before he was president, the legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all, or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. So the top-down means what transition looks like when you have the government on your side. And the best example of this is Germany. 82 million people, 4 times the population of Australia, packed into 357,000 square kilometers, which is half the size of Queensland. And a decade ago, they decided they were going to put the German economy on a new path. And they created a feed-in tariff, a national feed-in tariff like you've had in certain areas. And that has proven to be incredibly successful. Now, as you know, parts of Australia had a feed-in tariff. And this helped to boost Australia's percentage of homes using photovoltaic cells to more than 10%. And I can see that because I've been flying into airports all over the country, and the first thing you see as you come down is the solar cells on roofs. Some of the communities in Western Australia have gotten up to 24%. You're on the road to transformative change. But, for reasons I don't totally understand, your premier killed the feed-in tariff. And I spoke to someone in his office today, and he said, well, we don't really need it anymore. People are going to change on their own. But the truth is that the feed-in tariff was generating so many people converting that the centralized utility was facing problems in the loss of revenue. So they stopped the feed-in tariff and they raised your rates. And what that shows is that there's a fundamental contradiction between your interests as citizens and consumers and the utilities' interests. Right now, to my mind, it looks like the government is siding with the utilities. So Germans intensified their commitment, and as a result, Germany shot from 6% renewables to 30% renewables. And they still get coal and gas and oil from Russia, and they dig their own coal. But they have 23,000 wind turbines and 1.4 million solar voltaic cells. They're committed to 80% renewables within the next 10 years. And it did not destroy any jobs. There are 380,000 people in Germany in the renewable industry. 150,000 of those are new jobs. Germany, having made this commitment, has the strongest economy in Europe and the lowest unemployment rate in Europe. So my main point here, which I look forward to discussing with you, is that if you're serious about creating jobs, you should be spending money on a growing industry, not a dying one. In 1903, the president of the Michigan Savings Bank was approached by a friend of his named Horace Rackham, who was a lawyer. And the lawyer had a client named Henry Ford, who had started something called the Ford Motor Company, and he wanted Rackham to become his lawyer and to give him $5,000 to invest in the firm. And so Horace Rackham asked his friend, the president of the Savings Bank, what he thought of this. And the president said, it's a crazy idea. The horse, quote, the horse is here to stay, and the automobile is a fad. Rackham ignored him, invested $5,000, and walked away with $12.5 million a few years later. And we need to remember that the telephone, radio, airplanes, television, computers, and the internet were all predicted to fail. But it was those who thought about the opportunities emerging in the future who got rich. That's what can happen with the top down. Bottom up is when the government does not support change systematically. And that, sadly, is the situation in the United States. And we have a situation somewhat similar to what you're facing, which is that traditional, powerful, status quo interests try to drive a wedge between communities, environmental groups, regular citizens, and labor unions. And they try and pit them against each other and accuse each other of destroying each other's future. And this used to be very severe. My friend Joe Uline, who is a major leader at our AFL-CIO, a major union, started off as a laborer pouring concrete at the controversial 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. And in the parking lot, where all the construction workers parked their trucks, he said that there were dozens of bumper stickers that read, hungry, out of work, eat an environmentalist. That was the kind of hostility that existed, but we are getting over that now. And we are finding, as I have found here in Australia, that when you get people together at the same table, which I did this afternoon, with union leaders and other people talking about a common future, there is much more flexibility and much more recognition of common interests. manipulation to create polarized camps. It's got to be stopped. So in the United States, I just want to mention that we have many, many local communities now that have stepped into the task of shaping their own economic future. And I'm going to mention a couple, but you should look them up on the internet because they're amazing. One of the most remarkable is Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. My father was born in Kentucky. It's in the center of the U.S., right on the edge of the South. And my sister lives there now. And in eastern Kentucky is a very large coal mine area where they have done mountaintop removal, where they have poisoned streams and water, and where people have been losing jobs and young people have been moving away. And Kentuckians for Commonwealth finally decided they wanted government to engage with this problem in a serious manner. And so they have organized and they have fought mountaintop removal, and they have passed the living wage requirement in the Kentucky legislature, and they have filed hundreds of bills to move forward the rehabilitation of that community economically, and they even spent the night in the governor's office to protest the government's complete submissiveness to coal. And they have a detailed plan for the future, which might be a model that you could look at. In Arizona, there are 200,000 Navajo people living on the Black Mesa Reservation, which has had up to 70% unemployment at times. To give up rights, and Peabody has extracted coal and uranium and natural gas and billions of gallons of water in a desert aquifer. And nothing happened about this until the Black Mesa people began organizing themselves. And they renegotiated contracts, they have developed local businesses and started building solar equipment on the reservation and revived their wool and sheep industry, which was very large at one time. And the key there is getting ownership back so that the local community can make decisions about how to benefit from the riches of their land rather than having it benefit other outside firms. And then in the Pacific Northwest, there was a huge fight over many years about a coal plant, 1,600 megawatt plant. It's now being closed. That will eliminate all coal from the Pacific West of the United States. But part of that agreement negotiated with the local community is a $60 million transition fund to support local communities and workers. So one of the things that is really important as you face these challenges is that we are discovering in the US and in other communities that the transition from high carbon, centralized, and in many ways toxic energy to safer, cleaner, renewable energy offers a rare opportunity to rethink and rebuild economies and communities in a new way. Okay, so that's top down, bottom up. Sides is really when institutions in civil society say, we've had enough, we want more leadership. And that's churches, universities, unions, all kinds of institutions of civil society. In the United States, and we can talk about this in the discussion, that is flowing around the divestment movement, the call to sell off stock in fossil fuel companies. 400 universities are now in turmoil about this. Stanford University dropped coal. Others are working on a list of 200 fossil fuel companies established, set up by Carbon Tracker. And even the foundation organized by the oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller's grandsons has divested from fossil fuel. And that's a huge sign. And in addition, a very interesting movement is rising called Divest Invest, which is, let's not just sell off the stock, but let's take that money and find ways to put it back in local communities. That's actively happening right now under the leadership of the Wallace Global Fund, and I hope that we can bring them here. And one of the reasons people are so upset is because, get this is amazing, the fossil fuel companies, particularly oil companies, are going to spend this year $674 billion looking for new reserves that we can't burn. $674 billion. And they do that for various reasons. We can talk about accounting rules, CEO compensation, and just general craziness. But what's happening is some investors are saying, you know what, now that we think about it, we could use the $674 billion better than you can. Would you please give it back to us? And that is putting a huge amount of pressure. They're saying, no, we're going to do fine. We're going to put it in tar sands or in drilling even deeper. But what this is raising is profound questions about the future of this whole industry. And that's why the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the largest fund in the world, $850 billion, just announced that over 2014 they had dropped 40 coal companies because they simply didn't believe in their business model anymore. And the city of Oslo announced their divestment of the municipal funds yesterday. This is building step by step, and we can talk about that a little bit if we want. Now, the whole point of this is not just to say no and talk about everything that's bad. It's also to talk about what we can do on the positive side. And that's under the heading of the New Economy. I was the president of the New Economy Coalition, and what the New Economy is, it's a big umbrella term that covers a number of terms and a number of ideas. People talk about a sustainable economy, a green economy, a solidarity economy, a circular economy, a shared economy, a generative economy. We have a list of 30 of these names. But what they all talk about is that for all the power of capitalism as it emerged in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, it is now not solving certain problems that we need solved. We have increasing inequality in the United States, in the country that always thought that the American dream, that everyone could advance no matter where they were. That is not true anymore. That's causing a crisis in American thinking. And climate change, where we've had, over 30 years, a fundamental failure to act. But what is now happening is the discussion of creating new and democratic models and sustainable models. And I'm going to list 8 of them very quickly, 8 ideas that are flowing. And what I want to point out is that this is part of a just transition movement. But it's in some ways it's even broader. It's not about a single industry. It's about local communities and their economies more broadly. So just to mention, the first is that there are groups like the Post-Carbon Institute, the Democracy Collaborative, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which are designing new models of ownership, new models of surplus distribution, new models of capital accumulation, and policies that support job creation by local communities. Secondly, we're seeing people experimenting with all different forms of models of design. Social enterprises, hybrid, nonprofit, and for-profit, something called a B Corporation, and a significant increase in cooperatives. The United States already has 100 million members in cooperatives, but those are growing. Number 3, specifically, we're seeing experimentation with the Mondragon model. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, that is a system of interlocked businesses developed in Spain, now has revenue of over 20 billion euros and well over 100,000 workers in all kinds of interconnected businesses. And when one business goes bankrupt, or when there's a downturn, they redistribute jobs and money so that people don't lose their livelihoods. It's a very interesting thing, and we're seeing a particular experiment in Cleveland around the world-famous Cleveland Clinic Hospital to be an anchor institution to supporting local businesses. Number 4, we're seeing new forms of financial investment that allow people to invest in their local economies. Weirdly, that was prevented by our securities laws for reasons we could discuss, but those law rules are being changed so that you can put money into a local business and not just into a bank. We are also seeing new technology reshaping how economies work. One of the best examples is a company called Etsy, where people who do crafts, many of them women in rural areas, many of them near the poverty line, who make beautiful things but have trouble selling them, could only go to the local farmers market. Now they have a national market. They're building an income stream for themselves. It's a new form of prosperity for people who otherwise have been cut off. We're also seeing the democratization of local energy systems. We have 2,000 publicly owned electric utilities in the U.S. that serve 42 million people, which is twice the population of Australia. And we're seeing that people are taking back. They sometimes privatize their utilities, and now they're taking them back. We're seeing, number 7, we're seeing community organizing and political initiative at the grassroots. So it's not the national government, it's not the state government, it is local communities, local mayors, Greensboro, North Carolina, Richmond, California, Jackson, Mississippi, Ithaca, New York, Detroit, Michigan, Boston, Massachusetts. All of them are now seeing innovation at that local level. And finally, we're seeing community foundations moving away from simply giving grants to seeing themselves as groups that are anchor institutions that drive community change. And what this means is that the energy crisis and the climate crisis is leading to a broader discussion of how to break free from too much corporate control of our national government and how to build vibrant, interdependent, resilient, democratic, prosperous local communities. Now, I hope that you see this as an encouragement and as a pathway to all kinds of opportunities that are embedded in the challenges. So I want to wrap up by just telling you a little bit about my sense of what might be possible in Australia. As I mentioned, this is my last speech. I've given something like 20 of them in 9 cities in 14 days. I've been busy. But it's been a huge, huge privilege. And as I've talked to people and sat in small groups and listened, I have learned some amazing things and met some remarkable leaders. And what surprised me is that despite the power of the fossil industry, despite the terribly misguided approaches of your government, you have everything you need to phase out coal and other fossil fuels and become the world leader in 21st century energy. Everywhere I went, I found something extraordinary. I mentioned that landing at airports, I saw the solar panels. I learned that the town of Mackay, in the center of coal country, gets 30% of its municipal power from renewable biomass, in this case sugarcane. And the company that does this said it could easily supply 100% of the local power needs if it received the right signals from government. It's amazing, right in the middle of coal country. I learned about the success of the Emu Downs wind farm, putting out 80 megawatts of clean energy right here. And the amazing, I don't know if you've seen this, but I read about the new wave technology from Carnegie Wave Energy Company right here on the Stirling Naval Base south of Perth that generates enough. This is a small demonstration project, and it demonstrates enough energy for 2,000 households. And the chief executive said, our wave resource in Western Australia is the best in the world, and theoretically enough wave resource, that phrase, hits our coastline every day and could power the state 10 times over. But they need financial support to go to scale. And as I mentioned, the people of the Latrobe Valley, having been battered and bruised, watching jobs disappear, having been treated like trash in the mine fire, have figured out that coal and the coal plant at Hazelwood is in a death spiral. That's their term, and they're ready to move on. They just need a clear plan and sustained support of their supposed leaders. So Australia is spending $200 million a week, $10 billion a year, $2,000 a year for a family of 4. Your money to support a dying industry. What if that money were shifted, putting Australia in the front? What would happen if the government reinstated a market incentive so that your goal was not 10% of homes, but 30, 40, 50, 60, or like Denmark, 100% renewable energy, which is what the study in New South Wales university said is possible. What if the government was really committed to building a beautiful Australia of the future rather than trying to prop up the past? Just like in the United States, your leaders, I believe, are failing you. And your future is at risk of being stolen. The long-term health of your economy and of the planet is being sacrificed by a small number of people to create short-term benefits for themselves. And that must stop. But here's my dream for you and for humanity. I want you to take hold of an opportunity that you are being handed by history. Now, I was a boy in the United States during the beginning of the American space program. And they used to take all of us kindergartners and first graders down to a room kind of like this, and we watch a tiny little TV in black and white. You could sort of tell that a rocket was being launched into space. But I thought this was such a fantastic embracing of the future, of moving forward. And so I've always loved all space movies. I'll go to any space movie. But recently discovered that so many movies now are about disasters, global disasters. We're being attacked by huge robots, we're being attacked by bugs, we're being attacked by really big bugs. Or the other theme is that we invented some technology and then it got out of hand and it's now threatening to kill us, like Planet of the Apes or World War Z or Contagion or Elysium, all these movies. There's actually, some of you may have seen the movie Pacific Rim, which is about huge creatures somehow moving through space-time up through the cracks in the center of the Earth, and they can only be stopped by 300-foot-tall robots in which two-person teams in the head can punch them to death. I just want to tell you, the Chinese robot team does not very well, and the Russian robot team, not so good. But it turns out that the largest, most hideous monster is defeated and the planet is saved through the cooperation of the Australian robot and the American robot. So there's a theme that runs through all of these things, that when faced with a global challenge that threatens our future, human beings can get over their political differences and stop blaming each other for who caused what, get over their political differences, and act together to save the world. Randall Robinson of Trans-Africa said, if you want politicians to lead, you have to form a parade, and they will find their way to the front. So Australians need to form bigger parades if you're going to do this amazing thing that is in front of you. So I want to conclude with a quotation from one of the most amazing men of the last 100 years, the South African lawyer Albie Sachs. Albie Sachs was a young white lawyer in Cape Town. He started working for the African National Congress for democracy in South Africa. He was threatened. He moved to Mozambique. One day he went and put the key in his car, and the car blew up. South African police, secret police, had followed him and wanted to kill him. Blew off his arm, blinded him in an eye. It took him a year to recover. But when he recovered, he was invited to come back to South Africa to become one of the first members of their Supreme Court. This man who'd been treated as a terrorist and nearly murdered becomes the leading arbiter of justice in South Africa. And he wrote a beautiful book, and in that book he describes how he was feeling when he stood in line to vote in the first truly democratic elections in South Africa. And that's what I want to conclude with. He said, did things just happen, or did we make things come about? I knew that nothing we were living through had just come to pass. We had willed it all, worked for it, never given up, and never let go of the basic ideas. Yes, we had believed. Belief had been fundamental. But we had backed that up with endless hard work, and we learned how to do things together and to accommodate the fears and interests of others, and to survive the sarcasm and disbelief of those who regarded themselves as more knowledgeable about what they called the real world. And we just kept on going, on and on, until at last the impossible became first feasible, and then real, and then finally inevitable. Impossible, feasible, to real, to inevitable. If you choose this path, it will become our common destiny. Thank you.